Hi, everybody. I'm Monsalit,
And I'm Dan.
and we are continuing our series on coaching starts before the session. And as we always say, we love to talk about what goes on outside the session, not just in the session. And today we're talking about core competency 6. Listens actively. Now, we know and we're very familiar with what this looks like in a session, but we're going to talk about, are you really listening to yourself? And what does listen actively mean when it's just about you, outside a session, outside being a coach, but in your everyday life? Are you listening to your own cues? What do you think, Dan? Are you listening to your own cues?
Half the time, probably not. Or am I listening to them and questioning them would be the other thing. Where I go with this one when I think about us as individuals, as human beings, that classic line that we would, when we start beating ourselves up and get into imposter mode, that we'll say things to ourselves that we would never say to another human being. We're certainly listening to that, and we're listening actively to it most of the time. But as we listen to it, do we begin in this journey of self growth and self awareness that coaches are really on? Do we begin to question that those voices and those thoughts that we have in our inside of our heads and experience to say, is it serving me, or is it, well, everything serves to one degree or another, but is it a primary payoff or a secondary payoff? But like, who whose voices are they sometimes, and what's the possibility to open up for growth when we start really paying attention and creating awareness around these things that are going on in our head?
Yeah, so there's the voices talking to us. What do they mean? How are they serving us? Something else I think about is overriding our intuition. When we have intuition and we don't listen to it, when we have that gut feeling, we look back and be like, I had the feeling and I knew it, but I still didn't, I chose something else. I think
Mhm.
also talking over our own signals. Um, and again, we talk a lot about it's not just in the head, it's in the body. So, how often are we disconnecting from our body, which is overriding our intuition? Because I think to hear your intuition, you need to be in your body and you need to be connected.
Very much so. Yep.
And
Because we're
listening to your body. Sorry to interrupt you.
Mhm.
Listening to your body, listens actively to your body. I mean, we hear our body when it hurts, but we never think our elbow when it isn't causing us any problems.
Mhm. And we think about, being with a client, and how many times have we seen a client be in the state of overthinking of how am I going to do it, and getting all worked up into the story they have about what they're allowed to do, what's possible in the situation. And we go, that's us too. When we pull back and consider ourselves as the expert in our lives, which we've talked about that in the previous episode, how how are some of these dialogues that we have with ourselves helping or hindering our progress and growth? And very much the overriding the intuition thing, because it's not necessarily something we hear in the way we hear the imposter thoughts. It's more of a feeling through the chest and into the core. But it's so easy, particularly in Western culture, to ignore that, because we're told to think, pay attention to the thoughts and the ideas versus what's really true in the embodiment.
Yes, we are also, taught to push on or push through. Don't listen to your body. You've just got to go do it. You've got to be strong. And so I think for me, I'm almost taking listens actively as two parts. Listens actively to my body and listens actively mentally. And how can we combine those two? Because that really is when we sit in a session and we are talking to the client, we ask them, how does that feel in your body when you say that? We are helping the client to acknowledge what's going on in their body and somatically as they are having insights or as they're saying things. Are we doing that to ourselves? Are we listening actively to our body when that voice is telling us that we're worthless and we can't do it? And who do you think you are? Like, what's our body
Mhm.
feeling like? How is our body feeling in that moment, right? Um, Self-listening really does shape client listening. And I want to ask you, if you aren't listening actively, and like you said, half the time we do it, half the time we may not. But now we're aware. We're aware that, like, hey, we should be taking this competency, bringing it into our everyday life. If we aren't going to listen actively to our body and to ourself, and we're going to listen to those voices instead, and we're going to override our intuition, how will that show up possibly in our session?
Will tend to listen to reply and respond instead of listening to learn, because the story will already be there. So we'll just receive the data. And what'll tend to happen is we'll come back with a really quick answer because we just want to move them along to what are you going to do next, which again, the theme through this series of recordings, this series of episodes is the doing overriding the being. So if we're listening to respond to others or to self, we're not breaking through anywhere. When we start listening actively to, how do I want to say this, to get curious. Our own internal stories have been there for a long time. So we just take them as a truth when we hear those expressions in our head, rather than, is it? And does it have to be? Or does that's it's been there for this long? Does it have to be there for the rest of my life? What would be the opposite of it? What else could I go? So thinking about how we show up for a client to challenge maybe limiting perspectives, not to tell them you have a limiting, but to challenge it and open it up to explore it. Can we do the same for self? And what would that slow down mean? Because so much of listening actively is taking those pauses after the client stops speaking and saying, okay, like, let me get all that in my head before I say a word. But do we do that for ourselves and give ourselves the space and grace?
Yeah, wow, that's really important. And I'm thinking right now as you were saying that, I know we're not really talking about the session in this session in this, but as you move into PCC and MCC in coaching, you're trained to say, "Hey, look past the story. The story's there, but what's really happening?" We're not focused on the story of the problem. We're kind of focused on the person. And I wonder, that has to happen through active listening. So, in our own life, if that's true in the session, that we need to sort of bypass whatever the story is and really focus on the person, how can we be applying that same concept in our own lives as we're sitting here in our life and we're listening to our own stories, our own good voices, bad voices, whatever? Are we also saying, wait, okay, the story is the story, but like what's happening to me underneath this story?
Mm-hmm. And who wrote it?
Hmm.
Like, there's both someone authored that story. Ultimately, it's us allowing that authorship to be the story of our life. So there comes a choice of, do we begin actively writing the new story versus the chapters that we were maybe given to us that we learned over time? Um, is there a big plot twist coming? It's like, oh, plot twist. I'm taking charge of my life now.
Right, right. And being curious, right? It comes back
Mm-hmm.
to the other competency of how do we be curious with ourselves while we actively listen to the thoughts that are going on with us. And I just had some other thought to tell you, and I forgot it, slipped my mind. Um, I think it was around, well, it's past. Maybe it'll come back to me.
Just give it a second to come around. We'll listen for it actively.
Yes, exactly. So we have listening actively as a human being in charge of your intuition, not being in charge of it, but being aware of it, connecting the mind to the body. What might be some other ways that somebody could begin to listen actively for themselves?
Journaling seems to jump up, and even to the point of the journaling as an exploration of what are the thoughts that I hear constantly in my head, and if they're limiting or negative thoughts, of again going back to this curiosity of journaling to understand and learn, not journaling to document and lock them in as a capital T truth of like, So this is what I'm hearing in my head. Is it true? And start to really ask back to something. Are these things about me true? Just as we, it's so important. And where have I maybe, this one's it would not be a coaching question, but where have I heard that before? Or who have I heard that from? That we start to learn, we take on stories of others that we don't question until we start to notice they're interfering with our goals in life.
Yeah, it's so stream of conscious, kind of like writing as stream of conscious.
Mhm.
And then that leads me to, because at some point, even in the core competencies, and we know even outside the core competencies, they all intertwine, just like they do in the session. There are times when we have to refer out, and we can only listen so actively to ourselves until at some point we might need to refer ourselves out for the help to help us see what we can't hear or help us understand, right? At what point might you say, okay, I've been doing all of my own active listening, it's time to refer myself out?
When I find that I'm peak and valley on a real, like, make a little bit of movement, fall back, make a little bit of movement, fall back, and it's the constant pattern of that sabotage, um, or potentially not taking action at all with the new information. That finding someone to be that mirror to figure out where the gap is in our awareness to our action, or understanding why we might be resistant to taking that action. And is it risk aversion, is it fear of success, which is so big,
Hmm.
doesn't get talked about a lot, but fear of success is huge. um, and that really, that's most easily done with another person as our mirror.
Right. And as you were saying that, I was thinking, well, it may be a coach, it might be a therapist. If you're
Mhm.
dealing with the voices that are self-sabotaging you, that you can't seem to create a dynamic with, there could be many ways to refer yourself out depending on what it is you need.
Yeah.
So that's all I have for core comp since listens actively. But we do know for listening actively, to be a great listener in the session, you have to be able to listen to yourself outside, listen to your intuition, stop overriding your own signals. Uh, Anything else? I feel like there was something that maybe we wanted to touch on. Sorry, I was ending and now I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to bring us back in.
Go for it.
But there was something around our intellectual responses versus our embodied awareness.
The list, it takes me back to listening to respond of, like, we already have the answer, which we do for ourselves, and we'll just shut it down and explain it away, versus so much of this comes down to slowing down to be present and noticing those responses, coming more to an observer state. They're like, oh, I notice I shut myself down when these things come up, and noticing that pattern so that we can offer more and come into the embodiment of listening, that we're listening with all of our senses and really tuning into our intuition before we ever just start moving forward again.
Yes, yes. You couldn't have said it better. So that's all we have. If you liked what you heard today and you are a coach and you would like to get some continuing education credits for the core competencies, we have a program that you can do online at your own pace, at your own time. You have it forever. And not only do we go into how these competencies work with you personally, we do talk about them outside the session. We also address them on every single level, ACC, PCC, and MCC. If you would like more information on that, check out our link below, and we will see you in the next episode.
All right. Be well, everybody.
Bye.